Frank Hudson came home to silence. The lights were on, the door was unlocked, but the house felt wrong. He called out their names, Caleb, Joshua, his voice echoing through empty hallways. Nothing. He walked faster now, heart pounding. Valerie? Still nothing. The twins' toys were scattered on the floor, their jackets hung by the door, but they were gone. Frank's chest tightened, his hands began to shake. For the first time in his life, all his money, all his power, meant absolutely nothing. He whispered a prayer he hadn't prayed in years. God, please, not them. And then, through the fear, through the silence, something inside him said, go, keep searching. What he found deep in the woods at a forgotten cabin glowing with a single light would shatter everything he thought he knew, because the woman protecting his sons wasn't who he believed, and the truth hiding in those walls would bring him to his knees. Frank stood in the center of his empty house, phone trembling in his hand. He'd called Valerie 3 times, no answer. He pulled up the security footage, the cameras he'd installed after Rebecca died. There she was, packing a small bag, helping the twins into their jackets, glancing around as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Then, she buckled Caleb and Joshua into her old silver Honda and drove away. No note, no call, no explanation. Frank's mind raced. Where would she take them? Why? He grabbed his keys and ran to his car. As he pulled out of the driveway, he whispered another prayer. God, lead me to them, please. He remembered the GPS tracker he'd installed in Valerie's car months ago. He pulled it up on his phone. The blinking dot showed her heading north, deep into the wilderness. He followed. The roads narrowed, the streetlights disappeared, trees closed in like walls. The GPS signal flickered, then died. No service, no connection, just darkness. Frank slowed, panic rising. What if I lose them? Then, through the trees ahead, he saw it, a faint, warm glow, a light that shouldn't be there. He stopped the car, stepped out into the cold night, and walked toward that light, his feet crunching over fallen leaves, his breath visible in the chill. The forest opened into a clearing, and there it was, a cabin, old, weathered, barely standing, but a single light burned inside, soft and steady. Standing in front of the cabin, holding a hammer like a weapon, was Valerie. Behind her, pressed against the doorway, were Caleb and Joshua, alive, safe. "Valerie!" Frank shouted, his voice breaking. She spun toward him, shock flooding her face. The twins ran to him. He dropped to his knees, pulling them close, trembling with relief. "Daddy," Caleb whispered, his voice scared. "There was a man. He tried to come inside." Frank's blood went cold. He looked up at Valerie. "What man?" Her voice shook. "Someone who's been watching this place. I grabbed this to protect them." Frank stood slowly, pulling the boys behind him. "Why are we here? Why did you bring my children to this place?" Valerie's eyes filled with tears. The walls she'd kept up for 18 months began to crack. "Because," she whispered, "this is where your wife grew up." Frank froze. "This cabin belonged to Rebecca's mother," Valerie continued, her voice breaking, "and she asked me before she died to bring the boys here one day." Frank stared at her, his world tilting. "Rebecca never told me." "She didn't tell you," Valerie said softly, "because she was afraid you'd see her differently." "What are you talking about?" Valerie took a shaky breath. "I'm her sister, Mr. Hudson, her half-sister, and she made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd make sure the boys knew where she came from." The forest seemed to hold its breath. The twins looked between their father and Valerie, confused. And Frank realized that God had led him here, not to punish him, but to show him a truth he'd been too blind to see. But before we continue, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story reminds you that sometimes God takes everything away just to show you what truly matters. Frank Hudson woke that morning to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the faint sound of his sons laughing downstairs. He lay there for a moment, listening. It was a sound that still surprised him sometimes, joy in a house that had been silent for so long after Rebecca died. He got up, dressed, and made his way to the kitchen. Valerie was at the stove, flipping pancakes while Caleb and Joshua sat at the table, their faces sticky with syrup, their voices tumbling over each other as they told her about a dream one of them had. "Morning," Frank said, pouring himself coffee. Valerie glanced over her shoulder and smiled, small, polite, the way she always did. "Good morning, Mr. Hudson. There's breakfast if you'd like." "I'm good with coffee." He leaned against the counter, watching her. She moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, wiping down the counter, refilling the boys' juice cups, never asking for help, never complaining. He'd hired her 18 months ago, not long after the grief had become too heavy to carry alone. The agency had sent 3 candidates. Valerie was the third. She'd been the quietest, the least polished, but when she'd sat down with the twins that first day, something in her voice had made them stop crying. Something in her presence had made them feel safe. Frank had hired her on the spot. "I have some errands to run today," Valerie said softly, not looking at him. "I'll have the boys back by dinner time." Frank nodded absently, scrolling through emails on his phone. "That's fine." She hesitated, then added, "It might take a little longer than usual." He looked up. "How long?" "Maybe late afternoon." Her voice was calm, but there was something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite read. "Where are you going?" "Just some personal things I need to take care of." Frank studied her for a moment. Valerie rarely asked for time off. She rarely asked for anything. "All right, just keep your phone on." She nodded. "Of course." He finished his coffee, kissed the boys on their heads, and left for the office. He had back-to-back meetings all morning, investors, architects, lawyers. His company was in the middle of a major development deal, and every hour mattered. But around 3 o'clock, something gnawed at him. He checked his phone. No messages from Valerie. He called her. It rang once, then went to voicemail. He told himself it was fine. She was probably in a store. Maybe her phone died. He tried again an hour later. Same thing. By 5, Frank's chest had started to tighten. He left the office early, drove home faster than he should have, and pulled into the driveway just as the sun was beginning to set. The house was quiet. He stepped inside. "Valerie? Boys?" Nothing. The toys were still on the living room floor. Cars, blocks, a stuffed bear. The kitchen table still had crumbs from breakfast, but the house felt hollow, empty. Frank walked through every room, his pulse quickening with each step. The nursery, the playroom, the garage. Valerie's car was gone. His sons were gone. And for the first time in years, Frank Hudson felt something he'd almost forgotten, fear that couldn't be controlled, couldn't be fixed with money or power. Just fear. Frank's hands were shaking as he pulled up the security footage on his phone. He rewound to that morning, watching the screen with growing dread. There, Valerie in the hallway, at 9:47 a.m., carrying a small canvas bag. She stopped at the hall closet, pulled out the boys' jackets, the thick ones, the kind you'd wear if you were going somewhere cold. She folded them carefully and tucked them into the bag. Frank's throat tightened. The footage jumped to 10:15 a.m. Valerie knelt in front of Caleb and Joshua in the mudroom, zipping up their jackets, whispering something that made them nod seriously. Joshua reached up and touched her face, a gesture so tender it made Frank's chest ache. She hugged them both, then stood and led them toward the garage. The camera in the garage showed her buckling them into her Honda. She checked their seatbelts twice, adjusted Joshua's booster, handed Caleb his favorite stuffed dinosaur. Then she paused, her hand on the car door, and looked back at the house. Even through the grainy footage, Frank could see it: hesitation, worry, maybe even guilt. Then she got in and drove away. Frank stared at the empty garage on the screen, his mind racing. Why would she take them without telling me? Where would she go? He opened the tracking app, the one he'd installed in her car after Rebecca's death. At the time, he'd told himself it was reasonable, responsible, just in case something ever happened. Now it felt like the only thread connecting him to his children. The blinking dot on the map showed her route north through the city, then onto Highway 2, heading toward the Cascade foothills. The signal moved steadily for an hour, then slowed, then stopped. Frank zoomed in. The last known location was miles from anywhere, no towns, no gas stations, just forest. Then the signal disappeared. He grabbed his keys and ran. The drive felt endless. Frank's mind spun through every possible scenario. What if she's hurt? What if someone threatened her? What if she's been planning this for months, and I was too blind to see it? He thought back to the small things, the way Valerie sometimes stared out the window when she thought no one was watching, the way she'd pause when the boys asked about their mother, her face clouding with something Frank couldn't name, the way she'd once said, almost to herself, "They have her eyes." At the time, he'd thought it was just an observation. Now he wondered if it meant something more. The paved highway gave way to a two-lane road, then gravel, then dirt. The Range Rover bounced over ruts and rocks, branches scraping the sides. Frank's headlights cut through the growing darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and more trees. His phone had no signal now. The GPS was useless. He was driving blind, following instinct and desperation. Then, just as doubt began to creep in, the trees opened up. And there it was, the cabin, sagging, ancient, a single light glowing in the window, like a beacon. Frank threw the car into park and jumped out, his heart hammering. "Valerie!" She turned, and the look on her face stopped him cold. It wasn't fear, it wasn't guilt. It was relief. Before Frank could say another word, a sound split the air, heavy footsteps crunching through the brush behind the cabin. Valerie's body went rigid. She gripped the hammer tighter, positioning herself between the boys and the sound. "Get inside," she whispered urgently to Caleb and Joshua. "Now." But the twins didn't move. They clung to the doorframe, wide-eyed, frozen. A man emerged from the shadows, late 50s, unshaven, wearing a faded flannel shirt and mud-caked boots. His eyes swept over the clearing, landing first on Valerie, then on Frank, then on the boys. "Well, well," the man said, his voice rough and mocking. "Got yourself a whole family reunion out here, don't you, Val?" Valerie's jaw tightened. "Leave, Ray. I told you you have no business here." Ray. The name meant nothing to Frank, but the way Valerie said it with barely contained anger and something deeper, something like old pain, told him everything he needed to know. This man was not a stranger. "No business," Ray laughed bitterly, taking a step closer. "That's rich coming from you. This land belonged to Linda, and now that she's gone, it's mine." "It was never yours," Valerie said, her voice low and steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Linda left it to Rebecca, and Rebecca left it to me." Ray's expression darkened. "You got papers for that? Real ones? Because my lawyer says otherwise." Frank stepped forward, his instincts overriding his confusion. "I don't know who you are, but you need to back off, right now." Ray turned to him slowly, sizing him up with cold, calculating eyes. "And you must be the rich husband. Frank Hudson, right? The big shot developer." He spat on the ground. "Figures. Rebecca always did have a taste for men who could buy her a new life." "Don't." Valerie's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare talk about her." Ray ignored her, his attention fixed on Frank. "Did she ever tell you where she came from, Mr. Hudson? Did she ever mention this place? Or me?" Frank's pulse pounded in his ears. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't." Ray's smile was cruel. "She scrubbed us all away, didn't she? Pretended we never existed. Changed her name, got herself a fancy education, married into money, left the rest of us behind like trash." "You were trash," Valerie said quietly, but with a venom that made even Frank flinch. "You drank, you raged, you made Linda's life hell. Rebecca didn't leave you behind, she escaped you." Ray's face flushed with anger. He took another step forward, and Frank moved instinctively, placing himself beside Valerie, a wall between this man and the children. "You need to leave," Frank said, his voice dangerously calm. "Now, before I call the sheriff." Ray laughed again, but there was no humor in it. "Go ahead, call them. Let's see whose story they believe, the billionaire who doesn't even know his own wife's past, or the man who's got legal documents saying this property is his." He backed toward the trees, his eyes never leaving Valerie's. "I'll be back, with the law, and when I am, you're all going to wish you'd listened." Then he disappeared into the darkness, his footsteps fading into silence. Valerie's legs buckled. She sank onto the porch steps, the hammer slipping from her hands, her whole body shaking. Frank stood frozen, his mind reeling. And the twins, still clinging to the doorway, whispered in unison, "Daddy, who was that man?" Frank didn't answer his sons. He couldn't. His mind was spinning too fast, trying to piece together fragments that didn't fit. Valerie stood slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Boys, come inside," she said softly. "It's getting cold." Caleb and Joshua hesitated, looking to their father for permission. Frank nodded, still unable to find his voice. The twins shuffled inside, and Valerie followed, leaving the door open behind her. Frank stood in the clearing for a moment longer, staring at the spot where Ray had disappeared. The forest was silent now, but the air still felt heavy with his presence, with his words. "Did she ever tell you where she came from?" Finally, Frank stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under his weight, sagging dangerously. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was smaller than it had looked from the outside. A single room with a fireplace, a worn couch, a table with mismatched chairs, a doorway in the back led to what looked like a tiny bedroom. Everything was old, faded, patched together but clean, cared for. Valerie had lit an oil lamp on the table. The soft glow filled the space with warmth, pushing back the shadows. The twins sat together on the couch, their shoulders touching, watching their father with uncertain eyes. Frank looked around slowly, taking it all in. "You've been here before," he said. It wasn't a question. Valerie nodded. She stood by the fireplace, her arms wrapped around herself. "Every month since Rebecca died, sometimes more." "Why?" "Because she asked me to." Valerie's voice was barely above a whisper. "She asked me to keep it standing, to make sure it didn't fall apart." Frank turned to face her fully. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything." Valerie closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. When she opened them again, they glistened in the lamplight. "Rebecca and I grew up here," she said quietly. "Not together at first. I was 3 when my father married her mother, Linda. Rebecca was 8. We were half-sisters, but it never felt like half. It just felt like sisters." Frank listened, his heart pounding. "Linda bought this cabin with insurance money after Rebecca's father died," Valerie continued. "It was supposed to be a fresh start, somewhere safe. But then Linda married Ray." The name hung in the air like smoke. "Ray was difficult." Valerie's voice trembled. "He drank, he yelled. Some nights were worse than others. So Linda would bring us here away from him, away from everything. This cabin became our escape, our sanctuary." She walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. "Rebecca and I spent every summer here. We'd swim in the creek, climb trees, tell each other stories. This was the only place we ever felt free." Frank swallowed hard. "Why didn't she tell me?" Valerie turned to him, and the look in her eyes was heartbreaking. "Because she was afraid, Mr. Hudson. Afraid you'd see her differently. That you'd look at her and see poverty instead of the woman you fell in love with." "That's not—" Frank stopped, the words catching in his throat, because he wasn't sure. He wasn't sure what he would have thought if Rebecca had brought him here on their first date. If she'd introduced him to Ray. If she'd told him she grew up in a cabin with no electricity, running from a stepfather who terrorized her mother. Would he have seen her the same way? Valerie must have seen the doubt on his face, because she looked away. "She loved you," Valerie said softly, "but she didn't think you'd love all of her." The silence in the cabin pressed down like a heavy blanket. Frank stood there, trying to absorb what Valerie had just said, but the words felt too big, too sharp. "She didn't think I'd love all of her," he repeated slowly, his voice hollow. Valerie didn't respond. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. Caleb shifted on the couch, his small voice breaking through. "Daddy, are you mad?" Frank looked at his son, those wide, innocent eyes, so much like Rebecca's, and felt something crack inside his chest. "No, buddy, I'm not mad." But he was. Not at Valerie, not even at Rebecca, really. He was mad at himself, for being the kind of man his wife felt she had to hide from. Valerie turned and disappeared into the small back room. Frank heard her moving things, the creak of old wood. When she returned, she was carrying a metal lockbox, rusted at the edges, with a small brass latch. She set it on the table between them. "Rebecca left these," Valerie said quietly. "She told me that if anything ever happened to her, and if you ever came here, I was supposed to give them to you." Frank stared at the box. His hands felt heavy. What's in it? Her words. Valerie's voice was soft, careful, the parts of herself she couldn't say out loud. Frank reached for the box slowly, as if it might burn him. The latch clicked open easily. Inside were several leather-bound journals, their covers worn and creased. Beneath them, a stack of old photographs and a cassette tape labeled in Rebecca's handwriting. For Frank, if he ever asks. He lifted the first journal and opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, neat, slanted, written in blue ink. The date at the top of the first page read June 2012. "I've decided to reinvent myself," the entry began. "Not because I'm ashamed of where I come from, but because I want to be someone who gets to choose her own story. I don't want to be the girl from the broken cabin with the angry stepfather. I want to be someone who walks into a room and isn't defined by what she survived." Frank's throat tightened. He turned the page. "I met someone today. His name is Frank. He's confident, successful, everything I'm not. He looked at me like I was already someone, like I didn't have to earn it. I think I could fall in love with him, but I'm terrified he'll ask about my family, about where I grew up. What do I say? Do I tell him the truth and risk losing him before we even begin?" Frank's hands began to shake. He flipped forward, scanning entries from the months and years that followed. "We got engaged today. I should be happy. I am happy. But I can't stop thinking about Val, about the cabin, about the life I left behind. What if he finds out? What if he thinks I lied to him?" Another entry, dated 3 years into their marriage. He asked about my childhood again. I told him my parents were gone and I didn't like to talk about it. The look on his face hurt, maybe, or confusion. It broke my heart. But I can't tell him. Not now. Not when everything is so perfect. What if the truth ruins us? Frank closed the journal, his vision blurring. He looked up at Valerie, who was watching him with quiet sorrow. "She was going to tell you," Valerie said softly. "Right before she died, she called me, said she was tired of hiding, that she wanted the boys to know where they came from. She was going to bring you here herself." Frank's voice came out rough, broken, but she never got the chance. Valerie shook her head. The aneurysm happened 2 weeks later. Frank set the journal down, pressing his palms against his eyes. The weight of it, the years of silence, the fear Rebecca had carried alone, it crushed him. "I failed her," he whispered. "No," Valerie said firmly. "You loved her. She knew that. But I made her feel like she had to be perfect." Frank's voice cracked, like she couldn't show me the parts of herself that hurt. Valerie stepped closer. "Then don't make the same mistake with your sons." Frank looked at Caleb and Joshua, still sitting quietly on the couch, watching him with those same knowing eyes their mother had. And he realized that this cabin, this place Rebecca had hidden from him, was the key to knowing her fully, and maybe to knowing himself. Frank sat at the table long after Valerie had tucked the boys into makeshift beds in the back room, sleeping bags she'd brought, blankets she'd stored here. The oil lamp flickered beside him, casting long shadows across the worn wood. Valerie returned and sat across from him, her movements quiet, respectful of his silence. "There's one more thing," she said finally. Frank looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. Valerie reached into the lockbox and pulled out the cassette tape. She set it in front of him, then retrieved an old battery-powered player from a shelf near the fireplace. She recorded this a month before she died. Frank stared at the tape, his wife's handwriting so familiar it hurt. For Frank, if he ever asks. "I haven't listened to it," Valerie said softly. "She told me it was for you alone." Frank's hands trembled as he picked up the tape. For a moment, he just held it, feeling the weight of something he couldn't name, dread, maybe, or hope, or both. Finally, he slid it into the player. He pressed play. Static crackled, then silence, then Rebecca's voice. "Hi, baby." Frank's breath caught. He closed his eyes, and suddenly she was there, not gone, not 2 years dead, but alive, speaking to him across time. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. And it means Val kept her promise." Her voice was warm, tender, exactly as he remembered. But there was something else beneath it, something fragile. "I'm so sorry I never told you the truth about where I came from. I was afraid, Frank, afraid you'd see me as broken, as less than. You put me on this pedestal, and I didn't know how to tell you I didn't belong there." Frank's throat tightened. "This cabin, this place saved me. Val saved me. And I need you to let her save our boys too. They need to know that strength doesn't come from having everything. It comes from surviving with nothing. It comes from loving people who can't give you anything but themselves." A pause. Frank could hear her breathing, could almost feel her presence in the room. "Frank, I loved you so much, but I don't think you ever really knew me." Her voice cracked. "And that's my fault, not yours. I built a wall between who I was and who I wanted to be. I'm asking you now, tear that wall down. Let the boys see all of me, even the parts I was too scared to show you." Silence stretched. Then, softly, Rebecca began to sing. It was a lullaby, simple, a cappella, heartbreaking. The same one she used to hum to the boys when they were babies, the one Frank had heard 1,000 times but never knew the words to. "Hush now, my darling, the night is long, but morning will come with the break of dawn. I'll hold you close, I'll keep you warm, through every shadow, through every storm." Her voice wavered on the last line, as if she knew this was goodbye. The tape clicked off. Frank sat frozen, tears streaming down his face, his whole body shaking. He'd heard her voice in his head 1,000 times since she died. But this was real. This was her, reaching across the grave to tell him what she couldn't say when she was alive. Valerie sat across from him, her own cheeks wet, saying nothing. "She knew," Frank whispered, his voice raw. "She knew she was dying." Valerie nodded slowly. "She had headaches, dizzy spells. The doctors said it was stress, but I think she felt it, deep down." Frank looked at her, this woman who'd been in his home for 18 months, caring for his sons, honoring a promise to a sister she'd lost. "That's why you came to us." "Yes," Valerie's voice was barely audible. "She reached out to me a year before she died. We reconnected. She wanted the boys to know me, to know where they came from. She was going to tell you everything, but..." She ran out of time. Valerie wiped her eyes. "So, I applied to be your maid. It was the only way I could be close to them without telling me the truth." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Would you have believed me if I had?" Frank opened his mouth to say yes, but the word wouldn't come. Because he didn't know. And that uncertainty, that doubt, felt like the deepest betrayal of all. Frank didn't sleep that night. He sat by the dying fire, Rebecca's journals open on his lap, reading her words over and over as if they might somehow change. Valerie had fallen asleep in the chair across from him, her head resting against the wall, exhaustion finally overtaking her. The boys were curled together in the back room, their soft breathing the only sound in the cabin besides the crackle of embers. Frank read until the sky began to lighten pale grey, bleeding into soft blue. He read about Rebecca's childhood summers here with Valerie, about the nights they hid in this cabin while Ray raged in town, about the dreams she'd had of escaping and becoming someone new. He read about the day she met him, the fear, the hope, the choice she made to leave her past behind. And he understood, finally, why she'd never told him. Because he'd never asked, not really. He'd accepted the polished version of her she'd offered, the elegant wife, the perfect mother, the woman with no baggage and no past. He'd been content with that, maybe even preferred it. And she'd known. The sound of vehicles approaching pulled Frank from his thoughts. He stood quickly, moving to the window. Through the trees, he saw a sheriff's truck and Ray's beat-up sedan bumping down the dirt path. Valerie woke instantly, her body tensing. "He came back." Frank's jaw tightened. "Stay inside with the boys." "No." Valerie stood, her voice firm. "This is my fight too." They stepped out onto the porch together as the vehicles came to a stop. A woman in uniform climbed out of the truck, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, no nonsense. She adjusted her hat and walked toward them with measured steps. "Morning," she said, her tone neutral. "I'm Sheriff Linda Ortiz. Got a call about a property dispute." Ray climbed out of his car, a smug grin on his face. "Told you I'd be back." Sheriff Ortiz held up a hand, silencing him. "Mr. Kimball claims this property belongs to him, says the current occupants are trespassing." She looked at Frank and Valerie. "I'm here to sort this out, peacefully." Frank stepped forward, keeping his voice calm. This cabin belonged to my late wife, Rebecca Hudson. It was passed down to her from her mother, Linda Kimball. Valerie Brown is Rebecca's sister and the current legal owner. Ray scoffed. That's a lie. Linda left everything to me when she died. I've got the paperwork. Then let's see it, Sheriff Ortiz said evenly. Ray pulled crumpled papers from his jacket pocket and handed them over. The sheriff examined them carefully, her expression unreadable. These look like property transfer documents, she said slowly, but they're not notarized, and there's no probate stamp. Ray's face reddened. My lawyer said, your lawyer should have told you that unsigned documents don't hold up in court. Ortiz handed the papers back. Do you have anything else? A will? A deed? Ray's jaw worked, but no words came out. Ortiz turned to Frank. And you, Mr. Hudson? Do you have documentation proving ownership? Frank pulled out his phone. I can have my attorneys here within 2 hours, with authenticated copies of Linda Kimball's will, Rebecca's inheritance documents, and the transfer to Valerie Brown. All legally filed and notarized. The sheriff nodded. I'll need to see those before I can make any determination. She glanced at Ray. Until then, nobody's getting removed from this property. Ray's face twisted with rage. This is bull. Mr. Kimball, Ortiz's voice cut like steel, I suggest you calm down and wait for the legal process to play out. That's how this works. Ray glared at Valerie, his eyes full of venom. You think you've won? You think hiding behind your rich friend changes anything? This place was never yours. You were never family. Valerie's voice came out quiet but unshaken. I was more family to Linda and Rebecca than you ever were. Something in Ray's expression cracked just for a moment, and Frank saw it. Not just anger, pain, the kind that comes from being left behind. Sheriff Ortiz stepped between them. That's enough. Mr. Kimball, you need to leave. Now. Ray stood there a moment longer, his hands balled into fists. Then he turned and stalked back to his car, slamming the door hard enough to make the frame rattle. As his taillights disappeared into the trees, Ortiz turned back to them. Get me those documents by noon, Mr. Hudson. And Miss Brown. She paused. I remember your sister. She was a good person. I'm sorry for your loss. Valerie's eyes glistened. Thank you, Sheriff. Ortiz tipped her hat and left. Frank and Valerie stood on the porch in silence, the morning sun breaking through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. He's not going to give up, Valerie said quietly. I know, Frank looked at her, but neither are we. After the sheriff left, Frank made the calls. His attorneys promised to have everything ready by noon. Documents, deeds, authenticated wills, everything that would prove Ray Kimball had no claim to this place. But as he ended the last call, something gnawed at him. Why does he want it so badly? Frank asked, looking at Valerie. This cabin is falling apart. It's worth nothing. Valerie frowned. I've wondered the same thing. Ray never cared about this place when Linda was alive. He hated coming here. Frank looked around the clearing, his developer's instincts kicking in. The location was remote, yes, but it was also pristine, untouched forest, a creek running nearby, mountain views. Did Rebecca ever mention anything valuable here? Mineral rights? Water access? Valerie shook her head slowly. Then she paused. Wait, Linda used to say something. She'd joke about her insurance policy. I always thought she meant life insurance, but... Their eyes met. The boys, Valerie called toward the cabin. Can you come help us look for something? Caleb and Joshua tumbled out onto the porch, their earlier fear replaced with curiosity. What are we looking for? We're not sure yet, Frank said, kneeling to their level. But your grandmother might have hidden something important here. Think you can be treasure hunters? Their faces lit up. Like pirates? Exactly like pirates. They searched systematically under floorboards, behind loose wall panels, in the small crawl space beneath the cabin. The boys treated it like an adventure, giggling as they squeezed into corners their father couldn't reach. It was Joshua who found it. Daddy, there's something in here. Frank rushed to the fireplace where Joshua was peering behind a loose stone in the hearth. Frank carefully pulled the stone free. Behind it was a waterproof bag, sealed tight against time and moisture. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were land surveys, geological reports, and a letter from a development company dated 6 months before Linda's death. Frank's blood ran cold as he read. The letter offered $2.3 million for the property and surrounding 40 acres. The reason? Potential lithium deposits. "My God," Frank whispered. Valerie leaned over his shoulder. "What is it?" "Lithium. This land sits on top of a significant mineral deposit." Frank flipped through more documents. "And look at this, Rebecca blocked the sale 5 years ago. Through an LLC I didn't even know she had." Understanding washed over him like cold water. His company, Hudson Development, had tried to acquire land in this area 5 years ago for a resort project. The deal had fallen through mysteriously, blocked by an anonymous LLC that refused to negotiate. He'd been furious at the time, called it one of his rare failures. It had been Rebecca. His own wife had stopped him. "She protected this place," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "She gave up millions to keep it standing." Valerie's eyes filled with tears, because it meant more to her than money ever could. Frank looked at the documents, then at the cabin, then at his sons playing in the dirt with sticks, their laughter filling the clearing. Rebecca had chosen this place over wealth, over him, in a way. And now he understood why. Because some things, some places, held memories that money couldn't buy, and power couldn't protect. This cabin was where Rebecca had learned to survive, where she'd learned to hope, where she'd promised Valerie they'd always be sisters. Frank pulled out his phone and called his head attorney back. "Change of plans," he said. "I want this property secured legally in Valerie's name and held in trust for my sons, and I want mineral rights protected in perpetuity. This land is never to be sold or developed. Ever." Valerie stared at him. "Mr. Hudson." "Frank," he corrected gently. "My name is Frank." She swallowed hard. "Frank, you're giving up millions." "No," he said, watching Caleb and Joshua chase each other around a tree, their joy uncomplicated and pure. "I'm finally understanding what my wife tried to tell me. Some things are worth more than money." He looked at Valerie, this woman who'd spent 18 months in his home, caring for his sons while honoring a promise to a sister who died too soon. "You're not the maid anymore," Frank said quietly. "You never really were. You're family, and I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." Valerie's composure finally broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "She wanted you to know," she whispered. "She wanted you to see this place, to understand." "I do now," Frank said, "and I'm going to make sure our sons never forget where their mother came from." For the first time since Rebecca's death, Frank felt something shift inside him, not the weight of grief, but the beginning of something lighter. Understanding, acceptance, and maybe, finally, peace. 3 months later, Frank stood on the newly repaired porch of the cabin, watching the sun filter through the pine trees. The roof had been replaced, the sagging boards reinforced, the windows restored. But the character remained the rough-hewn logs, the stone fireplace, the wildness pressing in from all sides. This place wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, and that was exactly how it should be. Behind him, he heard laughter. Caleb and Joshua ran past, chasing each other with sticks they'd turned into swords, their voices echoing through the clearing. Valerie sat on the porch steps, peeling apples for pie, her hair pulled back, her jeans dusty from working in the garden they'd planted last month. She looked up and caught Frank watching. "What?" "Nothing," he said, but he was smiling. "Just, this is good." She smiled back, soft, genuine, the guarded walls between them finally gone. The legal battle had ended quickly once Frank's attorneys produced the authenticated documents. Ray's forged papers had been exposed, and he'd slunk away, facing fraud charges. Frank had offered to drop them if Ray agreed to stay away permanently. He'd taken the deal. Valerie was now the legal guardian of the property, with the boys named as future inheritors. Frank had ensured the mineral rights were locked away, untouchable. This land would never be sold. Never developed, never turned into something it wasn't. Rebecca would have wanted it that way. Frank walked to the large oak tree at the edge of the clearing, the one Rebecca used to climb as a girl. Last week, they'd carved something into the trunk. He ran his fingers over the letters now. Hudson Brown family, built on truth, bound by love. "Daddy, look," Joshua called, holding up a smooth river stone. "I found one for Mummy." They'd started a tradition every time they visited. Each of them would find a stone from the creek and add it to the collection they were building beside the porch. A cairn of remembrance. Frank walked over and examined the stone. "That's perfect, buddy." Joshua placed it carefully on the growing pile, then stood back, satisfied. Caleb tugged on Frank's sleeve. "Do you think Mummy knows we're here?" Frank knelt down, looking into his son's eyes, Rebecca's eyes. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think she does." "Is she happy?" Frank's throat tightened. He thought about the journals, the tape, the years Rebecca had spent hiding parts of herself because she thought he couldn't handle the truth. "I think she's at peace," Frank said finally, "because we finally understand." Valerie joined them, wiping her hands on her apron. "Pie's almost ready." The boys cheered and ran inside. Valerie started to follow, but Frank caught her arm gently. "Thank you," he said. She tilted her head. "For what?" "For keeping your promise, for loving them when I didn't know how, for showing me who Rebecca really was." Valerie's eyes glistened. "She loved you, Frank, even when she was afraid, even when she couldn't say it out loud." "I know." Frank looked back at the cabin, at the life they were building here, messier and truer than anything he'd built before. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure the boys know all of her, not just the parts she thought were acceptable. All of her." Valerie squeezed his hand. "She'd be proud of you." They stood together in the fading light, the smell of wood smoke and pine in the air, the sound of the boys' laughter drifting from inside. Frank had spent his whole life building empires, towers of glass and steel, monuments to success and control. But here, in this humble cabin surrounded by wilderness, he'd finally learned what Rebecca had known all along. That home wasn't something you built with money or power. It was something you created with truth, forgiveness, and the courage to see people really see them for who they truly were. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, Frank felt something he hadn't felt since Rebecca died. He felt whole. Not because the pain was gone, but because he'd finally stopped running from it. He'd walked straight into the truth, the complicated, messy, beautiful truth, and found that love was waiting on the other side. Inside the cabin, Valerie called them in for dinner. The boys' voices rose in excited chatter, and Frank, standing in the doorway of the place his wife had kept hidden, realized something profound. Sometimes God takes everything away, comfort, certainty, control, just to show you what you couldn't see when your hands were full. He'd lost Rebecca, but in losing her, he'd found her fully, and in finding her, he'd finally found himself. Frank stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him, and sat down at the table with his family, the one he'd been given, and the one he'd almost lost by never truly seeing. The lamp glowed warm in the center of the table, the pie steamed between them, and for the first time in years, Frank Hudson bowed his head and said a prayer of gratitude. Not for what he had, but for what he'd finally learned to see.